welcome my friends to Doc Dave's Gut Feelings. We are going to go into today a deep dive that literally has been decades in the making. And I want to take some time to kind of go through the evolution of my thoughts and feelings regarding Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Before I do that, if you like what you hear, if you like what you see, please take some time to think about whether you want to subscribe. Certainly give the video a like. Help the channel along. I certainly appreciate it, and I appreciate the time. You have a lot of other choices out there. So, for those of you who've been to my channel, or some of you might have even been in a class or two of mine, it's no secret that I do not have a lot of like or respect for the current way in which Maslow's hierarchy of needs is presented, its current forward face to the world. So where did this start for me? This started way back in the 1980s as an undergraduate in my first social psychology course. But it came to a head in graduate school in my personality theory final. It came to the question, the last question on the exam, which was on Maslow. And I refused to answer it. I took the final. I went up to my professor, Stu Taylor. Hey, Stu, thank you. And I said, you know, Stu, I just think this theory is a pile of crap. I'm not going to answer it. And he said, Dave, that's fine. It's your choice. Just know that if you don't answer it, you're going to get a B in the course. And I said, that's fine. I'll take the B. Since then, have continued to have a lot of issues with the current way, the contemporary way in which the pyramid is presented. I think it's sexist. I think it's racist. I think if anyone devotes more than 2 active neurons to thinking about what the theory says, at least how it's presented to be saying, it falls apart like a house of cards. And the fact that people continue to make a lot of money off of this, just every day or so in my YouTube feed, videos come up presenting it as this model that purports to teach us, sell us on how to be all that we can be, how to be self-actualized. That's not the case. Absolutely not. Hence, one of my favorite quotes from 4 of 5. That's my designations for children of mine. 4 of 5. He said when he was 8 years old, "They're filling your head with lies." He was railing against something. And he's right on so many levels. And it's in this case, it happens to be true. That is not what Maslow was saying with his model. And the fact that people continue to present it as if that were the case astounds me. The fact that people, academics in particular, continue to completely misinterpret his original writings from the 1940s, particularly the Psych Review paper that presented the model, which is not a hierarchy. The paper is called A Theory of Motivation. It's not called a hierarchy of needs. Yes, he presents 5 needs, but it's a theory of motivation. And people get we'll get into what the hierarchy actually is and what it means. But it's not a pyramid. It's not step-based. You don't go through it at each level. We'll get into what I feel the weaknesses of the current presentation are, and where I feel Maslow ultimately shot himself in his proverbial foot. So with that in mind, let us go on to talk about the current presentation of this Platonic ideal about striving and reaching for the best we could possibly be, the hierarchy of needs. So, this is how it is currently presented. There are a number of different ways it's been adapted, but in essence, this is it. Yes, in the 1940s, actually close to for a decade before that, Maslow had been working on this idea, trying to integrate different perspectives of biological and human motivation. And he settled on 5 general types of drives, motives, things that energized behavior and action. And this is how it's been presented. That you have these needs: physiological, safety, love and belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. Those multidisciplinary words are a bitch, aren't they? So the way the model is presented is that everything under the top exists for the sole purpose of allowing us to ascend to the top. It's like current models of evolution, that everything under us as a species exists for the sole purpose of allowing us to exist. It's like saying everything under the very top flake of paint at the top of the Eiffel Tower exists for the sole purpose of allowing that fleck of paint at the top of the Eiffel Tower to exist. It makes absolutely no freaking sense whatsoever. But this is what they say. You've got your physiological needs. They have to be satisfied. They have to be met. If they are not, you're gone. So, if you grow up in poverty, sorry, you don't get to have your wishes, needs, ultimate desires, that one true wish. Yeah, you don't get to have that. You don't get to have love. You don't get to have friendship. You don't get to have self-confidence. No. You don't get to have the respect of others. No. Because you grew up in poverty. Sorry, you're gone. Think about that. For once. Because it makes no logical sense. Safety needs. If God forbid you grew up in a violent family, if you were physically, emotionally, sexually abused, same thing. You're kicked off of the pyramid. And once you're kicked off, you don't get to come back on. Sorry, you're gone. Love and belongingness. Where did J.D. Vance get his idea about lonely, childless cat ladies who are just angry at the world? Got him from here, didn't he? Kind of makes sense from a J.D. Vance perspective. If you don't get love, you don't get belongingness, you don't have friends, you're isolated emotionally, physically, you don't collect $200, you don't get to go up the pyramid. Once you get once you get all of those met, then you get to focus on yourself. You get to say, screw the rest of the world, because that's what all those other things at the bottom are. They're the little folk. Now you get to focus on you. You get to do you, boo. I get to enjoy the fruits of my labor. I get to bask in the glow of other people, and how other people respect me, and other people acknowledge me, and other people give me all the accolades for what I am and how good and wonderful I am. And that builds your self-confidence. And that builds your independence. And that allows you to be all that you can be and achieve that one wonderful goal that you have set for yourself. But you need to have all those other things at the bottom. Now, Maslow benefited in his early writings from something called peer review. And that is, in the 40s and to a certain extent through the 50s, he would write papers, he'd send them out to academic journals, and other academics would write it and say, yeah, Abe, great idea, but I think you should do A, Y, and B, or A, B, and C, and send it back to Abe, and he'd revise and resubmit and blah, 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 blah. Later on in his writing career, he wrote books. And not so much with the peer review with the books. With the books, they have the editors. And with the editors are not so much, maybe you should do A, Y, and Z. The editors are more in line of the copy editing, shall we say. Yeah, maybe a little bit with the content, but not with the same rigor as peer review. And because of that, we get things like this. In the later writings, and certainly with the interpretations of his work, we have things like Maslow saying, when you start off with 100 people at the bottom of the pyramid, by the time you get to the top, only 2. That by his own words, self-actualization is not the norm, it's the exception. This is not a model about how to be all that you can be. This is a model about how 98%, by his own words, 98% of people don't get what they want. So for somebody to present it as a model of teaching you about how you can get all that you want makes absolutely no sense. Another thing that he said, women, lower propensity, sorry babes, lower propensity for self-actualization. Why? Because you have, as women, an unhealthy emotional attachment to your own biological offspring. You have a lower capacity to love. Men, however, because we are never, and this is according to Maslow, in his own writings, go look it up, because men are not 100% sure that we are the genetic fathers to our own offspring. We have a greater capacity to love. And that greater capacity to love and to share that love means that we have a greater propensity to love, to satisfy that need to love, and rise up the pyramid to self-actualization. So men have a greater propensity to self-actualize than women, according to Maslow, in his own words. Bunch of crap. This was in his later writings. None of this crap is in his earlier writings, the academic writings. And it's those academic writings that I want to focus on, because those are largely ignored today, and those, I feel, are really, really, really important. And I, at least, would like to get back to a discussion of what he originally said, because I think it's really important to focus on what he originally said. So let us get to a little bit of the background behind, kind of like setting the stage for where he was coming from. Now, psychology around the turn of the century, last century, that is, it was a relatively new discipline academically that was, kind of treading water, trying to find its feet, trying to find some credibility as a discipline. And it was floundering. Let's be perfectly honest about that. It was floundering. And it needed to establish some credibility quickly. And the way it did that was through adopting the research and the research philosophy, shall we say, of what has collectively been known as the physical sciences or the hard sciences. I categorically reject the idea of the hard and soft sciences. I'll give you a reason why. The only reason why I think they're called hard and soft sciences is called igneous rock is hard and the human brain is a soft material. If you look into using the scientific method and the principles of science to investigate a phenomenon, studying the brain is hard. Studying igneous rock is relatively easy by comparison. So using that distinction makes absolutely no logical sense to me whatsoever. The principles are the principles. And everybody, regardless of what you study, uses them imperfectly. Us, yeah. But every other branch of science, hard, soft, and everywhere in between, uses them imperfectly as well. Anyway, we incorporated the scientific method and the tools of the scientific method, research-wise, as a way to study human behavior. And we did so principally using animal models. Now, using animal models, psychologists identified a variety of different behaviors and motives that drove human behavior, and at least animal behavior. And we drove our field forward, moved the ball down the field. That study, or that field of study, became known as behaviorism. It led to the development of operant conditioning. It led to the development of, a variety of classical conditioning. And it identified some central tenets that we still use today. 4 basic motives: hunger, thirst, sex, pain avoidance, and homeostasis as a fundamental mechanism through which all 4 of these motives drive human behavior. Now, psychologists ultimately were interested in human behavior. So the question becomes, great, wonderful, fab, but how do we take what we have learned from our animal models and apply it to human behavior? And that's where the question becomes. That's where things get messy, because there is no concerted, or there was at the time, some would argue there still is, excusez-moi, mesdames et mes amis, there still is no consensual set of definitions as to what are psychological motives. What is the relationship between mind and body? Are there similar mechanisms for mind and body? Are there psychological motives independent of physiological motives? How do they work? All of that. And what Maslow wanted to do was integrate psychological motivation with physiological motivation. One and the same. Not dissimilar from a generation or so earlier than him, from what Freud did, which is what he was doing, essentially. Coming up with a complete, holistic picture of human behavior that incorporated physiological and psychological development and behavior. So that is basically the framework, the underpinnings for what Maslow was trying to do. Take what we learn from the behaviorist, animal-centered study of motivation, physiological study of motivation, and build upon that and incorporate it into a more human-centered study of motivation, with one important caveat, that the mind and body work with one mechanism. And that is hugely important. And that mechanism is homeostasis. Hey, welcome back. So, I'm going to focus in excruciating detail on two papers that Maslow published in 1943. The first is a preface to motivation theory, and the second is his seminal psychological review paper, A Theory to Motivation. Now, a preface to motivation theory is a paper that is not talked about that much when you hear about Maslow's theory, but I feel it's very important because what it does is it outlines his theoretical assumptions, essentially the reasons why, the things that he felt were important, for why you needed to integrate biological and psychological perspectives for essentially a unified theory of human motivation, which at the time was radical, hugely radical. We kind of take it for granted, particularly if you have something other than an MD. Sorry, my MD friends, but MDs continue to push the biological reductionist perspective that everything can be boiled down to biological perspectives, whereas psychologists believe that we, in more Gestalt principles, not that biology is unimportant, but we do believe that we are greater than the sum of our parts, that you can boil us down biologically and you still will not come anywhere close to understanding the concept of love, so that we do transcend our biology to some extent. How and why that occurs, we don't know, and we may never know. But that's a tension that exists between a psychological approach to understanding human behavior and a biological approach to understanding human behavior. It was there in the 40s, and it's here now, 80 years later. And what Maslow attempted to do was, at least within the study of human motivation, try to come up with a way of unifying these two very different, diametrically opposed perspectives. One that said biology rules everything, screw everything else, and the other that said we can't learn anything about human behavior from understanding biology, which is essentially what was a growing movement within psychology at the time. So understanding his reasoning for developing a unified theory of motivation, I think, is key to setting the stage for his psychological review paper and understanding the 5 basic needs. So with that in mind, let us go into Maslow's preface to motivation theory, published in Psychosomatic Medicine in 1943. So, and again, I apologize for all of the words. Again, you can go find these papers for yourself if you want to get into the more specifics of them. But I felt it was important to kind of just get a sense of what he's trying to say. Now, what Maslow said was important were, and he outlined, essentially, I'm summarizing here, but he essentially outlined 13 reasons. I hate to say it, 13 reasons why. 13 reasons for integrating biological and non-biological perspectives. What he called animal-centered and human-centered perspectives. The first is that it's the only way to move the field forward. That an integrative model is by definition the foundational cornerstone for any general theory of motivation. And this falls into a broader contextual movement within science in general, a unified theory. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about physics or what Freud was trying to do. Freud was a unified theory. When you're talking about a unified general theory, you're talking about integrating different perspectives. And at least in the study of motivation, that is where he was coming from. You needed to integrate these different perspectives. This, for me, is key to everything that Maslow argued. And it is antithetical to the current pyramid. He said, you can't focus on physiological drives as the centering point for human motivation. You got to take them as given. And if you just give more than 2 neurons to thinking about it, it makes sense. If you're at a point in your life where you're even contemplating making a friend, then yeah, you've had enough food. It's a given. That's been met. You know, you've had enough to drink. You've slept. Maybe not enough, but how are you defining enough? The physiological drives, he rejected them as the centering point for human motivation. Of course, physiological drives are important. They're a biological necessity, an imperative, one would say. But to say that you have to have them satisfied in order to love and to have self-esteem and to satisfy psychological drives? That's self-evident because they're basic survival drives. Of course you've got to be alive in order to fall in love. Duh! So they're off the table. Because in order to have any psychological drive fulfilled, you've first got to survive. So in his mind, it made no sense to have physiological drives as the center of any model of human motivation. He also rejected the idea of coming up with generating lists of any type of need, like a need for achievement, a need for mastery, a blah, 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 blah. He said that any model should stress the goal not the way to achieve the goal. Because there are multiple ways to achieve a goal. Focusing on how to achieve the goal, that's a distraction. Because those are culturally determined. Those are influenced by the situation in which, context in which one finds themselves. Those are influenced by socioeconomic status. What matters is the goal itself. Plus, the goal is what's common across individuals, across people, across culture. How that goal is achieved is environmentally and socially and culturally determined. But the goal in and of itself, that is universal. That basic idea, that is very Freudian. In fact, it's another, well, it's what Freud said. He said, do not forsake the id. That there are these basic underlying needs. Freud called them, he had two needs, a need to create and a need to destroy, thanatos and libido. Ultimately, Maslow respectfully disagreed and said there were 5, but it's the same thing. Do not forsake them. Focus on these 5. He said that the basic unconscious goals, these 5 needs, are what's important. Not necessarily how, again, not how they are necessarily achieved, how they are fulfilled. Yes, how they are fulfilled, but the manner within which they are fulfilled. And that, yes, there are overlapping local cultural desires that can impact them. But it's the commonality of these unconscious goals that drive human behavior. And he noted a simple truth that motivated behavior, and he did note that all behavior is motivated, but that motivated behavior is simply a way to express and satisfy these 5 basic needs. That all behavior, on some level, is geared towards satisfying one or more of these basic needs, either individually, collectively, but that inextricably they are linked. Okay, let's move on to the next ones. All organismic states are motivating. What does he mean by that? That all behavior is geared towards satisfying these 5 basic needs. That's it. That's all that drives us. All behavior is geared towards satisfying these 5 basic needs. And here's where people get, I think, hung up on this hierarchy. Because he does say that there's a hierarchy. But the hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do directly with the 5 basic needs. And he first hints at this idea in the preface to motivation theory. He says that the needs arrange themselves in hierarchies of prepotency. Every drive is linked to the satisfaction or lack thereof of every other drive. So one drive is linked to another drive. Satisfying one drive is linked to another drive. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to activate another drive, but it may or it may not. It just says that they're linked. Every drive is linked to the satisfaction or lack thereof of another drive. He does say, interestingly enough, that we are in a perpetually wanting state. We are never completely ever satisfied. Hence, all behavior is motivated to satisfy. Now, what does he mean by this hierarchy of prepotency? What is prepotency? As I will argue later on, prepotency refers to our ability to pull these needs out of our unconscious mind. Remember, this is a very Freudian-based model. Not Freudian in terms of phallic stages, penis envy, all of that stuff. Freudian in terms of the structure of the human personality. Unconscious, subconscious, preconscious, conscious. According to Maslow, all of these 5 needs are unconscious. We have no direct awareness of them at any given moment in time. Doesn't mean we can't become aware of them. But the ease with which we can become aware of them, that's what he means by prepotency. And what the hierarchy refers to is how smushed down, how deep they are pushed into the unconscious mind. And the physiological needs, they are pushed so far freaking down. And we'll get to this later on. So what the hierarchy actually refers to is how far down in the unconscious mind the needs are pushed. Okay? Now, again, no practical or theoretical purpose in listing needs, so his model is going to focus just on the levels, hence just on the 5. And then finally, any theory of motivation unified because of his idea that you don't center things on physiological because they're a given. It should be centered on people. It should be centered on, yes, we're going to use the same mechanisms, in his case, a focus on homeostasis, but focus on what drives people to behave the way that they do, to achieve or satisfy these 5 basic needs. So, these last 3 are in many ways, for me at least, some of the most important and some of the least paid attention to. For me, most important because they are another level of integration because they integrate his work with basic social psychology and the work of Kurt Lewin. So when you take into account how an individual behaves, it needs to be done within the context within which that individual behaves. So the situation or the field within which the person reacts must be taken into account because a person doesn't behave within a vacuum. The possibility of isolated, specific, partial, or segmented reactions must be taken into account. Here's an example of what I talk about when I talk about how we just unconsciously mold and shape and change our reactions. So you're sitting in a baseball game, and you know your friend is like 3 people down from you, and you say, "Hey, Bob, pass the fucking beer," and he passes the beer. And let's just say you're sitting, it's coming up in a couple weeks, right? You're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner across the table. You go to your mom. You say, "Hey, Mom, pass the fucking mashed potatoes." No. Do you consciously think about it? Do you go, should I yell at my mother to pass the effing mashed potatoes? You don't. We automatically modify, change our behavior, our mannerisms, our language, everything based on environmental context. That's what social psychologists have been saying for decades. That's what Maslow said back in 1943. And that's exactly, I mean, it's true. We don't even think about it. It's what happened. And he said you need to take it into account when you talk about a general model of human motivation. And he's right. And even on a broader level, his last point, behavior is almost always biologically, culturally, and situationally determined. Maslow said that. And you sure as hell wouldn't know that when you're looking at the darn pyramid now, would you? Now, with all of those precepts, his preconditions for developing a general, integrated, unified theory of human motivation, let us now move into what Maslow wrote back in 1943, his psychological review paper, A Theory of Motivation. Hello, my friends. So, we're back, and the pièce de résistance, we have made it to Maslow's psychological review paper from 1943, A Theory of Motivation. Now, it is in this paper where Maslow outlines 5 human needs. I will go over these needs. I will also go over what he describes as the characteristics, or shall we say organizing principles, of these basic needs. And as with any good substantive theory, I will spend some time talking about what Maslow outlined back in 1943 as what he saw as the path forward for research and thinking about a unified, integrated theory of human motivation. He never used the words hierarchy of needs. And if he never used them, I don't know why other people do. I don't know. But anyway, it is sad to me that the limitations of the theory that he put forward under a section in his article called Limitations, which are essentially directions for future research to go, are largely directions that have been left to wither and rot and die. That is sad, because one can only think about how with 80 years of research under our collective belts, how much farther down the road, down the field, the ball would be if people had bothered to listen to what Maslow had written, and even if Maslow had bothered to listen to what Maslow had written way back in 1943. So with that in mind, my friends, a summary of what Maslow proposed back in his original psychological review paper, A Theory of Motivation. So, Maslow presents 5 needs. I'm going to roughly group them into 3 levels: physiological or biological, social, and psychological / individual. The biological, we know. Be quiet, insulin pump. Fatak. Even a super fatak. Physiological. This is the most prepotent need. Now, what does he mean by most prepotent? Again, prepotent means it's the most deeply shoved down into the unconscious mind. Here's his example from the paper. A person lacking food, safety, love, esteem would probably desire and crave and act on hunger for food above all else. That means if you lack self-respect, if you want a friend, if you're looking for a place to sleep and you're also hungry, you're going to go get that goddamn Snickers bar. And according to Maslow, why? Because that drive for hunger is buried and pushed so far down in our unconscious. It requires an inordinate amount of our resources, psychically, psychologically, to pull up into our conscious mind. It takes so much energy to get up into our conscious mind, that hunger drive, that it, for lack of a better word, consumes us. We are driven to satisfy it beyond all other measure. Because it is so far down, because it is the most prepotent. So that's what the hierarchy refers to. The hierarchy refers to how far down in the conscious mind a need resides. The farther down, the more of our energy it takes to satisfy it, because it sucks up more resources in the now. Right? It makes perfect sense. So physiological are the most prepotent need. When we are aware of them, they suck up every resource that's available to us now. The next 2 on the list, and I will refer to them as a list. I do not refer to them as a hierarchy, and he never referred to them as a hierarchy. They are a group. Safety. And he saw these as active and dominant mobilizers for an organism's resources. We need to feel safe in order for us to be able to marshal those things that we need to achieve the things that we need to do, right? We need to feel safe in order for us to go out into the world and act upon our instincts, act upon our desires, act upon our wishes. That is the ultimate goal of this safety. The love and belongingness, which is also a social need, he saw as core and fundamental in terms of psychopathology, and the thwarting or blocking or frustration of this need. He saw on the one end of the continuum, maladjustment. You just get a little bit pissed. But at the other end of the continuum, you can develop severe psychopathology. So we have the most prepotent, which are these physiological or biological needs. We have kind of like a moderate level of prepotency, which are these social needs, safety. which are kind of like an active or organizing principle needs. And then love, belongingness, which are also can act as organizing and mobilizing needs, but also they allow us a sense of feeling safe. Excuse me. Organizing principle, prepotency. I need to deal with that. Okay. Dealt with. Now, because, type 1 diabetic, blood sugars, prepotency, physiological needs taken care of. Now back to work. See, Maslow in the now. Severe psychopathology, our individual need, our psychological need, all of this sets the foundation, sets the tone, sets the capacity for us to go to or possibly satisfy these next needs. And remember, these needs are all jumbled together. They're all there. Esteem. Esteem is the core of self-respect, self-esteem. It's the foundation for achievement, for prestige. Certainly thwarting it, frustrating it, stopping it leads to feelings of inferiority, feelings of helplessness, even severe traumatic neurosis, according to Maslow. Interestingly enough, Maslow's father described him as the ugliest child ever born. In many ways, you can learn a lot about the theories of personality theorists by reading their biographies. So Maslow wrote a lot about the basic striving to overcome basic insecurity. Where did he come up with that idea? Well, if you grew up being called the ugliest child ever born, basic insecurity seems kind of like a given. So, finally we get to this other individual psychological need, esteem one, but this other individual psychological need, self-actualization. And in terms of what Maslow wrote, again, it's finding the right fit. And this is something that's been around for thousands of years. In an Eastern philosophical perspective, from my own culture, it's called Dharma. That you're born, to do one thing. And you find that one thing and you do that one thing. To not do that one thing is kind of like not a cool thing to do. You've got to find what that one thing is and then you do it. You got to find the right thing. You're meant to do it and you do it. Now, what is that one thing? We're not necessarily born knowing that. It's our job to kind of figure that out. And here's the kick. We're not always right. You might want to be a brain surgeon, but that might not be the right fit. There are plenty of people who are brain surgeons who probably shouldn't be, and plenty of people who are plumbers who could probably be better brain surgeons. The issue is what one can be, what one must be, and then trying to find that balance. And then within a broader, as he said, social, cultural, political context, trying to find the right fit. Yeah, it's complicated. Now, he said, this is like direct quote from his paper, in our society, satisfaction, yeah, the Stones were right. But it's not, I can't get no satisfaction. 98% of people don't get no satisfaction. Satisfied people are the exception, not the rule. Okay, so here is, for me, some of the most fascinating parts of this paper. The characteristics of the basic needs. The order, if there is an order, it's not fixed. You jump around, you go from one to the other. Even if you want to put them in a damn order, you don't go through them sequentially. There is no step. You can jump from one to another because they are not activated in sequence. There is no sequence. What's really fascinating is that he talks about the idea of exceptions. That there are people who are just born with high ideals, people who are given every single advantage that society has to offer. And because of that, they are born with the belief, or given or endowed by society with the belief that they are, shall we say, martyrs. That they are owed everything. You know who these people are. They're exceedingly, irritating. At least to me. By definition, life is about becoming tolerant with the idea of frustration. Now, as a social psychologist, this is particularly interesting because one of the first theories social psychology started investigating scientifically was frustration aggression theory. The idea of you try to achieve a goal, someone stops you from doing that, and one behavioral option from a multitude of behavioral options to deal with that frustration is violence. It's a motivated behavior. It satisfies a need. How one deals with frustration, how one becomes tolerant of frustration, hugely important. Have we investigated that enough? Studied that enough? No, of course not. And violence continues to plague us. Imagine where we would be if there were 80 years of rigorous research into the idea of tolerance with frustration. I don't know. I think maybe a little bit better than we are right now. Satisfaction is relative. It's relative within an individual. It's relative from one need to another need. Your level of satisfaction for love, belongingness, is not the same for self-actualization. It's not the same for physiological needs. And for sleep, it's not the same for hunger or for thirst or for pain avoidance or even for sex. And even for sex, it's not the same for on a Monday than it is for a Sunday, or on your birthday than it is for Christmas. So the idea of where that homeostatic satisfaction level lies is key. And he talks about that. Maslow talks about that, and we will when we get to the limitations in a minute. Again, all of these are unconscious. These needs are unconscious. We are not directly aware of them at any given moment in time, but they are all kind of bubbling there in the unconscious. Again, a very Freudian perspective. And it's a perspective. Is it right? Is it wrong? It's a way of thinking about things. It's not about whether it's right or wrong. It's a language. It's almost like a metaphor. It's a way to give you a way of thinking about how these things might work. So they're unconscious, they're bubbling there, and then one pops into your conscious mind and that drives a behavior. You act upon it. It energizes a set of behaviors. Maybe 1, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 20. It satisfies maybe one aspect of a need. Maybe it satisfies 2 needs. Maybe it satisfies none. But that's how these things work. There's a certain cultural specificity to how this stuff goes, which is very interesting. But there's also some generality. There's generality in terms of how we deal with things, but there's also very specific ways in which we deal with things. And that's something that Maslow was very interested in. Now these last two may seem like kind of like reciprocally related, and to some extent they are, but they are different. So yes, multiple motives can lead to a single behavior, and a single behavior can be related to multiple motives, but certainly any behavior can have multiple determinants, and motives are one of a variety of different determinants of behavior. There are a few other basic characteristics of the 5 basic needs that he mentioned. And after that, then we're going to get into talking about the limitations. So, again, he emphasizes this again and again and again and again. And given the number of times that Maslow talks about this, I'm beginning to think that he thinks this is kind of important. The goals are at the center. And what are the goals? He is using, and this is a function of language, and he gets to this when he talks about the limitations. He's using goals and the 5 basic needs interchangeably. So the goals and the needs are the same thing. The goals are the needs. The animal and human-centered are intermixed. They are inextricably linked. You cannot look at them independent of one another. I hear this all the freaking time. Oh, nature versus nurture, and it just makes me go insane, because there's no such thing as nature versus nurture. And you know why there's not nature versus nurture? Because you cannot study one independent of the other, no matter how much you might try. The only question that makes sense, to my limited way of thinking, is nature and nurture. It's an interactive model. They work together inextricably to influence behavior. It's nature and nurture. It's mind and body. It's psychological and biological. That's what he was saying. And in my way of thinking, he's right. Motivation and psychopathogenesis are also inextricably linked. Understanding a general theory of motivation is central to understanding a general theory of psychopathology. And his theory of motivation was his first step in attempting to articulate a general theory of psychopathology. And finally, gratifying, and in the process of gratifying or satisfying these needs, how that happens, why that happens, the processes, mechanisms through which that happens, all of that is what drives the human condition. That's what he was saying. So with that, let us move into what for me, it's one of the most fun parts of the psychological review paper, A Theory of Motivation by Abraham Maslow. The limitations. He noted right off the bat that there are huge limitations, as there always have been in the study of human motivation, with the definitions of things. What is a drive? What is a wish? What is a desire? What is a need? What is a goal? And the reason for this is partly because of the methodology we use. We use the scientific method because we want to have a consensually agreed upon definition that multiple researchers from different countries around the world, different labs, we agree upon a definition, we take that concept, we use it in our labs, we investigate it, and then we, report out our findings. The only way we do that is because we first have to agree upon a definition. That was relatively easier to do in a behaviorist context than it is when we're doing human-centered research. So this idea of consensually agreed upon definitions, it was a problem 80 years ago. It was a problem when I was doing this research more actively 30 years ago, and continues to be a problem today. Then we have the issue of what is the relationship between all of these things? What's the relationship between an appetite, a desire, a need? How is this satisfied? How do we make judgments about satisfaction, level of satisfaction? What about partial levels of satisfaction? How do we decide what is or is not good? Pretty early on in graduate school, I had decided that as a social psychologist, I was relatively uninterested in studying individuals between the ages of 18 to 24, which is the social psychological sample of convenience. Just about every social psychologist studies people between ages 18 to 24. I wanted to know how the things that we social psychologists study developed, so how people became that way. And I wanted to know what happened after the age of 24. So over the course of my career, I have been lucky enough to study young children and people as old as the age of 104. Maslow talked about this too. One of the limitations in terms of theories of human motivation that he noted 80 years ago is that we know relatively nothing about the basic etiology, the basic development of needs, how they develop, grow, change in early childhood, how they're molded, how they shape, how they're influenced by society, culture. That's what some of my work did 30 years ago. And others have taken it, gone with it. It's wonderful to see how that work has grown, shaped, changed, and molded. Largely over in Europe, not so much over here in North America, because people aren't really interested in that type of work here, which is rather sad to see. So one of the limitations, developmental change. A fascinating part of the limitation section of this paper is that Maslow outlines a whole section of implications for other theories in social psychology, clinical psychology, as well as psychotherapy. So his theory of motivation, he noted that there were implications for a more generalist hedonistic theory, for classical and operant conditioning. He would have noted for social learning theory, but that wasn't, around at the time, so I added that. For interpersonal relations theory, and he was a huge fan of Gordon Allport's functional autonomy theory, so he noted that there were implications for functional autonomy theory. And then finally, just placing things in a far broader sociological, anthropological context, he noted that there were implications for his model for a broader theory on society, social functioning, for a general theory of selfishness, because ultimately that's what he saw at the top of the model. This wasn't a theory about being all that you could be. This was a theory of selfishness. And he wrote it in the original paper, people. A theory of selfishness. And he saw profound implications for psychotherapy. And others have taken that and ran with it. And that's wonderful to see. He did see a lot of implications for work on the relationship between needs, goals, goal satisfaction, need fulfillment, and general cultural patterns in society. And that is our summary of Maslow's 1943 paper, A Theory of Motivation. But, lest you think I will leave you there, I have also been working on something very, very special. And you're about to see the world premiere. See you in a sec. Okay, let's move on, shall we? Now, I feel like it is incumbent upon me, after spending all of this time outlining how the pyramid, in my humble opinion, is a false and erroneous depiction of what Maslow actually intended. Well, what did he intend? And after much care and thought, I now present to you a reinterpretation based on the 1943 Psychological Review paper of what I consider to be Maslow's theory of human motivation. So, I've added one thing at the top. The rest are all Maslow's own words. Because when talking about human motivation and behavior, I kind of agree with Marcus Aurelius. And yes, this is what Hannibal Lecter said to Clarice Starling. But, he was quoting Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus was right. When you want to understand behavior and why somebody's doing something, anything, doesn't hurt to ask these simple questions. Of each particular thing, ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature? What does one do? What does one seek? And remember what Maslow said, not how he has been interpreted, reinterpreted, rejiggered over 80 years. What he said: all behavior is motivated, and all motivation and all behavior is to satisfy 5 basic needs. Those are the goals. That's it. That's what we seek. To satisfy these 5 needs. Now, We're going to proceed from right to left. Why? I'm South Asian. Right to left is what we do, baby. So, as I said, I'm kind of like imposing, just because it makes more sense in my mind, these three different levels. We have a biological level, we have a social interpersonal level, and we have a psychological level. That is the functional integration that Maslow talks about, the integrated model of human motivation. He proposed 5 basic needs, and we've talked about them. They've been defined. The biological level, he defines physiological needs. At the social interpersonal level, he defined safety and love belongingness. And at the psychological level, he defined esteem and self-actualization. Now, interestingly, these are all in one bucket, and that bucket resides in the unconscious. Now, you can go back and forth. Remember what he said. There is no order. There is no step. You can go up and down, left, right, wherever. Because there is no sequence. There is no order. So what does this hierarchy? And he does use the word hierarchy. I'll give you that. What does this refer to? As I argue, and I think as he argues, this idea of prepotency refers to the hierarchy or relative hierarchy of access to conscious awareness. How far down these are smashed into our unconscious. All of them are. And again, how the most difficult, the most difficult it is to get out, that's the physiological. The easiest, the ones that take the least amount of effort and energy to activate into conscious awareness, those are esteem and self-actualization. That's the reason why he says those physiological needs, they really don't drive human motivation, because we're unaware of them most of the time anyway. And it takes so much effort and energy to activate them that they consume our behavior once they are activated. Remember what he said. That it doesn't matter what your other needs are at any given moment in time. Once they're activated, you are driven to satisfy them, because that hunger drive predominates everything else to satisfy. So at any given moment in time, these psychological needs, the individual ones, they're at the surface bubbling around. They require very little energy and effort to activate and motivate and drive human behavior. So to say that these physiological needs are central to no, they're not. And that's why. So we have unconscious, preconscious, conscious. That's just the Freudian interpretation. But that is what this idea of prepotency refers to. And once it is in conscious awareness, collect $200, go means go, Thunderbirds are go, for those of you who are British like me, activation and allocation of resources to satisfy these basic needs. Boom! That's the model. And I've distilled some of his limitations, his criticisms, his characteristics of the basic needs, down to what I consider to be 4 overarching governing principles for the model. That the basic needs are activated and satisfied through homeostasis. Once it's activated, that motivates and drives behavior to satisfy, and then the need is quieted down, at least for a moment. All behavior is motivational. There is no set path. There are no steps. You can go from physiological right to self-actualization and right back down again. There's no such thing as getting off, getting on, going up, going down. And then multiple needs can activate and satisfy any given behavior, and any given behavior can have exactly the other interactive effect. This is my summary of his theory of human behavior as presented in the Psych Review paper from 1943. That being said, one small caveat. All of what we just said takes place in that little p. Because, as I mentioned, the final part of those limitations, everything takes place within a broader social, cultural, behavioral context, or what Kurt Lewin referred to in his seminal book, Field Theory and Social Science from 1951, as the field, the life space. And yes, certainly boiling all of human behavior down to a mathematical formula, you can critique it, you can poo-poo it, but again, it's a metaphor. It's a simplistic way of trying to give you a way of making sense, a language to describe what is nigh impossible to describe, which is why we do things. If you want to understand human behavior, you have to understand the individual and all of those things impinging upon what an individual does at any given moment in time. You try and wrap your mind around that. And that's in essence what Kurt Lewin and Abraham Maslow were arguing. So it's just easier to say life space of the individual. So all of what we just talked about, that theory of human motivation, all behavior is motivational. All of that takes place within a broader social, cultural, behavioral, political context. And you can't understand it. Even Maslow says this. You cannot fully appreciate, understand, predict, because that's what we forget. As psychologists, someone who practices this for a living, as psychologists, we forget that part of what we want to do, part of our commitment to our field as an academic discipline, is to be able to predict behavior. And we can't do that if you don't understand the behavioral context within which behavior and human motivation occurs. Maslow said that 80 years ago. We don't understand that 80 years later, at least to the extent that I think even Maslow would have thought, you should have figured that shit out by now, dudes and dudettes. But we haven't. What we have figured out is how to make pretty goddamn pyramids of the hierarchy of needs. Or, as I think Maslow would rightly call it today, because this is what he called it back in 1943, the hierarchy or a theory of selfishness. So, that's it, my friends. That is Doc Dave's deep, dare I say, my deepest dive into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or a theory of selfishness. Thank you very much for your time, your patience, and I hope to hear from you soon. Love you. Ciao for now.